I have broken 300 prisoners, and I broke every one of them the same way. I found what they were afraid of, and I held it over them, and they bent. That is the whole of my craft, and I was the best in the Dominion at it. And I am telling you this story because the day I interrogated the humans was the day my craft failed me. Not because the humans would not tell me their fear, but because they told me freely, immediately, without my having to pry it from them at all. And the fear they named was a thing I had never encountered in 300 breakings. A thing that did not bend them, but that has, ever since, bent me. I am Captain Esres of the Corvith Dominion. I came to find what humans fear. I found it, and I have not slept well since. Let me tell you how I work, because you have to understand my craft to understand how completely it failed. Every living thing fears something. That is the first principle of interrogation, the foundation everything else rests on. There is no creature anywhere that fears nothing, because fear is the oldest thing in any mind, older than thought, the deep animal knowledge of what must be avoided. And the whole art of breaking a prisoner is simply this: find the fear and apply it. Find what the creature cannot bear and threaten them with it, and they will give you anything to make the threat stop. Pain for some, death for many, the harm of someone they love for the ones who love. Humiliation, exposure, the loss of some precious thing. Every prisoner has a lever, and the interrogator's only real skill is finding which lever and then pulling it. I was very good at finding levers. 300 prisoners, 300 levers found, 300 creatures bent to my will. I had come to believe there was no mind I could not open, because there was no creature that feared nothing, and a creature that fears something can always, in the end, be broken. We had captured a human vessel. A small one, a scout, its crew taken alive in a boarding action. I will not tell you the details of the war, they do not matter, only that the Dominion was at war with humanity, and I had at last human prisoners to break. The first the Dominion had taken, and the High Command wanted what I always provided. Their fear found and mapped, so that the Dominion would know how to bend humanity the way I bent every prisoner. Find what humans fear, the command said, and we will know how to break them. And I, confident in 300 breakings, took the human captain into my interrogation chamber, certain that whatever humans feared, I would find it and find it quickly, and hand the High Command the lever that would bend a species. The human captain was a woman named Akoro. I remember her precisely, the way you remember the one prisoner who did not go as the others went. She was not large, not physically imposing, not what the war stories had led us to expect of the humans. She was calm. That unsettled me a little going in, because 300 prisoners had taught me the faces of fear, and the human captain did not wear any of them. Not the defiance that masks fear, not the calm that suppresses it, but something I had no category for, a genuine settledness, the bearing of someone who has already faced the worst thing and found it was not what she feared. I set that aside. They all break, I told myself. I have not yet found her fear. When I find it, she will wear the face like all the rest. I began the way I always begin, by establishing the frame, by making the prisoner understand that I held absolute power over them, that I could inflict anything, that their only path to relief ran through giving me what I wanted. And then I asked the question I had been sent to ask, the question that was supposed to be the beginning of the breaking, the question whose answer the High Command wanted above all things. I asked her, "What do humans fear?" And I expected the usual dance. The refusal first, they always refuse first, the reflexive defiance that I patiently dismantle. Then the false answers, the misdirections, the prisoner trying to feed me a fear that is not the real fear, to protect the real lever. And then eventually, under pressure, the truth, the real fear pried loose at last, the lever found. That is how it always goes. That is how it went 300 times. It did not go that way with Captain Akoro. She did not refuse. She did not misdirect. She looked at me with that settled calm that I was beginning to find unnerving, and she answered the question directly, immediately, as if she had been asked her name. She said, I'll tell you exactly what we're afraid of. But I don't think it's going to help you the way you want it to." And I felt the first cold touch of the thing that would not leave me, because a prisoner who freely offers their deepest fear is a prisoner doing something no prisoner does. And a prisoner who does what no prisoner does is a prisoner I do not understand. And I had never, in 300 breakings, failed to understand a prisoner. But I covered it and I told her to speak, and she spoke. And what she said is the thing that terrified me, the thing I have to tell you carefully because it is the heart of everything. She said, "We're not afraid of you. I want to start there because I can see that's what you're looking for, the thing you can threaten us with. Pain, death, the harm of the people we love. We're afraid of those things the way anything is a little in the body. But those aren't our deep fear and you can't break us with them, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Our deep fear, the thing that actually frightens us all the way down, is ourselves." She paused and her calm did not waver, and that was the worst part, that she said it so calmly. "We're afraid of what we're capable of. We've looked at it, every human looks at it, sooner or later, the thing inside us that could do anything. The cruelty we're capable of, the monsters we could become. We've seen what humans have done to each other across our whole history, the atrocities, the horrors, the things our own kind have been capable of. And we know that the capacity for all of it is in each of us, that there is no human alive who could not, under the right ruin, become the worst thing humans have ever been. That's our fear. Not you, us, what we might become, the monster we each carry and spend our whole lives making sure we never let out." I did not understand it at first. I want to be honest about that, because it did not fit my craft at all. A prisoner's fear is supposed to be a lever, a thing I can apply. And how do you apply a prisoner's fear of themselves? I cannot threaten her with what she might become. That is not a thing I control. The fear she had named was not a lever I could pull because it pointed inward at a thing inside her that no external force could reach. And in the first moment I thought, she has tricked me. She has given me a fear that is no use to me, a philosophical fear, a non-lever to protect the real lever. It is a sophisticated misdirection. I almost admired it. But she was not misdirecting. That was the cold thing that came to me slowly as she went on, as I understood what she was actually telling me. She was telling me the truth, the real, deep, true fear of her people. And the truth was a thing that did not bend her because it could not be wielded by anyone but herself. And that very fact, the fact that her deepest fear was beyond my reach, was the beginning of my own fear, because I realized that I was looking at a prisoner I could not break, not because she was brave, not because she hid her fear, but because her fear was of a kind that no interrogator could ever use. "Do you understand why you can't break us?" she said, and she was not taunting me, she was explaining, almost gently, the way you explain a hard thing to someone who needs to know it. You break prisoners by threatening them with the worst thing they can imagine. But the worst thing we can imagine isn't anything you can do to us. The worst thing we can imagine is what we might do, what we might become, if we ever let the monster out. You can threaten me with death. Death isn't my worst fear. My worst fear is becoming the kind of thing that would do to you what you're trying to do to me. You can threaten my body. My body isn't my worst fear. My worst fear is my own capacity for cruelty, and you can't threaten me with that because I'm the only one who controls it, and I've spent my whole life keeping it leashed, and nothing you do in this room can make me more afraid than I already am every day of myself." She looked at me steadily. "We're not hard to break because we're fearless. We're hard to break because we're afraid of the right thing, the thing that's inside us, that you can't touch, and a people afraid of what they might become can't be bent by anyone threatening what might happen to them. We police ourselves more harshly than you ever could. You've got nothing to threaten us with that's worse than the thing we already guard against in ourselves." And that is when the terror began, my terror, the captain's terror, the thing the title names. Because I understood, sitting across from that calm human woman, what I was actually looking at, and it was the most frightening thing I had encountered in a life full of frightening things. I was not looking at a fearless people. Fearless people are not especially dangerous. They are reckless, and the reckless break themselves. I was looking at a people whose deepest fear was their own capacity for atrocity, which meant they had looked at that capacity, measured it, knew exactly how terrible they could be. You do not fear a monster you have not met. The humans feared the monster in themselves, which meant they had met it, had seen its full dimensions, knew precisely what they were capable of, and were so frightened by it that they spent their whole lives holding it back. And a people like that is the most dangerous thing in the universe, because they are a leashed monster, and they hold their own leash, and the leash is tighter than any I could ever impose. But a leash that is held from within is a leash that could, in principle, be released from within, and the only thing standing between humanity and the atrocities they knew they were capable of was their own fear of becoming what they could become, their own chosen, internal, unbreakable restraint. I had come to find the lever that controlled humanity. And I had found that humanity was controlled by an internal restraint stronger than any external threat, that they held themselves back from horrors no one was stopping them from committing, out of fear of their own potential, and that there was nothing I could threaten them with, because they already guarded against something worse than anything I could do. The High Command had wanted the lever to break humanity. There was no lever. There was only a monster that held its own leash, more afraid of itself than of me, and I understood with a cold that has never left me, that a people you cannot frighten because they are already frightened of the right thing, themselves, is a people you cannot defeat, only hope never to provoke into letting go of the leash they hold so tightly and so terribly and so well. I will tell you the rest, what else the human captain said, and what I did with it, and what it meant for the war and for me, but you have the heart of it now. An alien captain demanded to know human fears. And the humans told her freely what they were afraid of, and what they said terrified her instead, because they were not afraid of anything she could do, but of what they themselves might become. And a people afraid of their own capacity for evil is a people who has seen that capacity and measured it, and chosen every single day to hold it back. A monster on a leash it holds itself, and the most frightening thing in all the reach is not the monster, but the knowledge of how tightly and how willingly and how alone. It holds its own chain. I should have ended the interrogation there. A wise interrogator, faced with a prisoner she cannot break, withdraws, reassesses, finds another approach. But I could not withdraw, because what Captain Okoro had said had opened a question in me that I could not leave alone, and the question was this: if the humans were so afraid of their own capacity for atrocity, so frightened of the monster they could become, then how did they fight a war at all? How did they do violence, command warships, kill, if the thing they feared above all was their own cruelty? It did not fit. A people terrified of becoming monsters should be a people incapable of war. And yet humanity fought and fought well, and I had their captain in my chamber as proof. So I kept her there, against my own better judgment, because I had to understand the contradiction, and the understanding of it is the second and deeper terror, the one that finished what the first had begun. I asked her, I said, if you fear your own capacity for cruelty so much, how do you fight? How do you do the violence of war if the violence is the very thing you are afraid of becoming? And Captain Okoro looked at me for a long moment, and then she said the thing that deepened my terror past anything I had felt before. She said, "That's the right question, and the answer is the thing your high command really needs to understand, more than anything about levers and braking. We fight precisely because we're afraid of becoming monsters, not despite it, because of it." She leaned forward, and her calm had something underneath it now, something old and hard. You think fear of our own cruelty would make us gentle. It's the opposite. A people who knows what they're capable of, who has looked at the monster and measured it, that's a people who takes the leash deadly seriously, because they know exactly what's on the other end of it. And part of taking the leash seriously is this: we will do controlled, deliberate, terrible violence to stop the monster from getting loose in the world, including the monsters in other people, and including, when we have to, the parts of war that would otherwise turn us into the very thing we're afraid of. We fight wars carefully, with rules, with restraint. With lines we won't cross even when crossing them would win, because the moment we cross those lines we've become the monster, and becoming the monster is worse to us than losing the war. Do you understand? We don't fight without fear of ourselves. We fight with it. The fear is the thing that keeps the violence controlled, deliberate, bounded, the thing that lets us do war without becoming war. And I understood then the contradiction's resolution, and it was worse than the contradiction had been. The humans were not a people incapable of violence because they feared their own cruelty. They were a people capable of enormous violence, who held it under the tightest possible control precisely because they feared their own cruelty. And the control was not weakness, was not hesitation, was a chosen, deliberate, terrible discipline. The discipline of a creature that knows it could do anything and has decided, out of fear of itself, to do only what it can do without becoming a monster. The fear did not make them weak. It made them the most dangerous kind of strong, violent but controlled, capable of atrocity but choosing restraint. A monster, but a monster on a leash held by the monster itself, which meant the violence I would face from humanity would always be deliberate, always bounded, always exactly as much as they had decided to permit themselves, and that a people whose violence is governed by their own fear of going too far is a people whose violence you can never exhaust, never push past its limits, never provoke into the wild flailing of a creature that has lost control, because they do not lose control. Because the fear of losing control is the deepest thing in them. There's something else you need to understand, Akoro said, watching my face, reading. I realized the progress of my terror the way I had spent my career reading the progress of fear in prisoners. The reason this should frighten your high command. You're thinking, a people this afraid of their own cruelty, this restrained, must be easy to fight. Just push them, and their restraint will hold them back while you do whatever you want. And that's true, up to a point. We will hold our restraint as long as we possibly can. We will fight with rules while you fight without them. We will lose ground, lose battles, lose people, rather than cross the lines we've drawn, because crossing them is worse to us than losing. She paused, and the hard old thing under her calm came fully to the surface. But here's what you need to understand about a monster that holds its own leash. There is a point, a far, terrible point that we pray never to reach, where the thing we're fighting becomes so great a horror that letting it continue would be a worse atrocity than anything we could do to stop it. And at that point, and only at that point, we make the most terrible decision our kind can make. We let the leash out. Not off, never off, we never fully let the monster loose. That way lies the end of us. But out a little as far as it has to go to stop the greater horror. And when humanity lets the leash out, when a people who have spent their whole existence terrified of their own capacity finally decide that the capacity must be used, there is nothing in the universe more terrible, because it is all that restrained power, all that measured and bounded and carefully leashed violence, released deliberately, with full knowledge of what it is, by the only people frightened enough of themselves to have kept it leashed that long. You do not want to be the thing that makes humanity let the leash out. Pray you never are. Because the only thing more frightening than a monster is a monster that has spent its whole life afraid of itself, and has finally, with grief and terror and full intention, decided that the time has come to be what it has always feared it could be. I sat in the silence after she finished, and I was more afraid than I had ever been in my life, more afraid than any prisoner I had ever broken, and I want to tell you exactly what I was afraid of, because it is precise, and the precision is the horror. I was not afraid that humanity was strong. Many peoples are strong. I was afraid because I finally understood the shape of what humanity was, and the shape was this. A people of enormous capacity for violence, who feared that capacity so deeply that they kept it under a restraint tighter than any external force could impose, and who would therefore, in ordinary war, fight with a discipline and a restraint that made them seem almost gentle, but who held in reserve, behind that restraint, the full unbounded horror of what they were capable of, released only when the alternative was a greater horror. And released then with the full terrible competence of a people who had spent their whole existence studying the monster they kept leashed. The Dominion had wanted to know what humans fear, so that we could break them. And the answer was that humans fear themselves, and a people who fears themselves is a people who has measured their own capacity for atrocity and chosen to leash it, and you cannot break a people like that. You can only push them, slowly, carefully, toward the terrible point where they decide the leash must come out. And if you are the one who pushes them there, you will face the thing they have spent their whole existence being afraid of, and you will understand, too late, that their fear was the only thing that had been protecting you. I ended the interrogation then. I had what the High Command wanted, the answer to what humans fear, and I knew, holding it, that it was not the weapon they had hoped for but a warning they did not want to hear. The humans could not be broken because their deepest fear was internal and beyond any lever. The humans would fight with restraint, with rules, with lines they would not cross, not from weakness but from the deepest possible strength, the fear of their own potential. And the humans held behind that restraint, a thing the Dominion did not want to provoke. The leash let out, the monster they feared, released deliberately by the only people frightened enough of it to have kept it bound. I went to the High Command with the answer, and the answer was, do not push them. Do not seek the lever, there is none. Do not mistake their restraint for weakness, it is the tightest leash in the reach. And above all, do not, ever, be the thing that makes them decide the leash must come out. Because a people who fears their own capacity for evil is a people who has that capacity in full, and the only thing standing between you and it is their fear, and you do not want to be the one who teaches them to set their fear aside. That is where part 2 ends, with the contradiction resolved into a deeper terror, with the understanding that humanity's fear of itself is not weakness but the tightest restraint in existence, and that behind the restraint waits the very thing they fear, released only at the terrible point where restraint becomes the greater evil. In part 3, I will tell you what the High Command did with my warning, whether they heeded it, or whether their pride pushed humanity toward the leash's end. And the last thing Captain Okoro said to me, before I released her, about why a people who fears their own monster is the safest neighbor in the galaxy and the most terrible enemy. And what it taught me, the breaker of 300 prisoners, about the difference between a creature with no fear and a creature afraid of exactly the right thing. The High Command did not heed my warning. I want to tell you that plainly because it is the hinge of the ending, and because I have spent the years since understanding why. Why a command structure built on the logic of levers and braking could not hear a warning that there was no lever and no braking, could only hear in my careful report a kind of cowardice, a captain who had been outmaneuvered by a prisoner and come back making excuses. They did not believe me. Of course they did not. I had spent my career delivering levers, and now I came back with no lever but a warning, and a warlike command that has been promised a weapon does not want a warning instead. They heard me say the humans could not be broken, and they translated it, in their pride, into the humans have not yet been broken hard enough, and they resolved to break them harder. I tried. I want that on the record, because it is the only thing I did in this whole story that I am not ashamed of. I went to the High Command and I told them everything Captain Okoro had told me, as clearly as I could, that the humans fought with restraint not from weakness but from fear of their own capacity, that the restraint was a leash held from within, that behind it waited the thing they feared, released only at the terrible point where restraint became the greater evil. I told them, do not push humanity toward that point. Do not mistake their rules and their lines and their careful bounded violence for a softness you can exploit. They are holding back. They are holding back deliberately, and the holding back is the most dangerous thing about them. And if you push them past the point where holding back becomes, in their own eyes, the greater wrong, they will let the leash out, and you do not want to see what is on the other end of it. And the High Command heard a frightened captain and disregarded her, and pursued the war the way the proud always pursue wars, by escalating, by doing the things that humanity's rules forbade, by crossing the lines humanity would not cross, by making the war into exactly the kind of horror that Captain Okoro had warned me would push humanity toward the terrible point. The Dominion began to fight without restraint, believing that a people who fought with restraint could be overwhelmed by a people who did not, targeting the things that should not be targeted, doing the things that should not be done, escalating the horror in the belief that the humans, bound by their rules, would be unable to respond in kind and would therefore break. For a time it seemed to work. That is the cruel part, the part that fed the High Command's pride. The humans did hold their restraint, even as the Dominion abandoned its own. They fought by their rules while we fought by none. They refused to cross their lines while we erased ours, and they lost ground for it, lost battles, lost people, exactly as Captain Okoro had said they would, because they would rather lose than become the monster. The High Command saw the humans losing and believed the warning had been the cowardice they took it for. They escalated further. They pushed harder. They did worse things, believing each new horror brought humanity closer to breaking. They were not bringing humanity closer to breaking. They were bringing humanity closer to the terrible point. And I, who alone understood what that meant, watched the Dominion march toward it with the helpless horror of someone who has read the ending of a story everyone else is still living, because I had sat across from Captain Okoro, and I knew what waited at the point the High Command was so eager to reach. Humanity let the leash out. I will not describe the campaign that followed in detail, because the details are not the point, and because some of them are things I do not wish to put into words. I will tell you only the shape of it. There came a moment. I do not know the exact horror that triggered it, the exact line the Dominion crossed that finally made the continuation of the war a greater atrocity, in human eyes, than the unleashing of what they held back. There came a moment when humanity decided that the time had come, that the restraint had become the greater evil, that the monster must be let out as far as it had to go. And what followed was the thing Captain Okoro had warned me of, the thing I had warned the High Command of, the thing the High Command had been too proud to believe. All of that restrained power, all of that measured and bounded and carefully leashed capacity, released deliberately, with full and grieving intention, by the only people frightened enough of themselves to have kept it leashed that long. The Dominion's war ended. Not in negotiation, not in the slow, grinding way wars usually end, but quickly, the way a thing ends when the leash comes out. And the speed of it, the terrible competent speed, was the proof of everything Captain Okoro had said, because a people who could end a war that fast had been holding back, all along, an enormous capacity they had refused, out of fear of themselves, to use. The restraint we had mistaken for weakness had been holding back exactly this, and we had pushed and pushed until they decided to stop holding it back. And then we learned, too late, in the only language our pride could finally hear, what the restraint had been restraining. I survived. I am one of the few of the High Command circle who did, and I think I survived precisely because I had understood, because I had not pushed, because in the records of the war there was a captain who had come back from interrogating a human and warned that this would happen. And the humans, I learned this after, the humans kept records too, and knew who among the Dominion had counseled restraint and who had counseled the horror, and they let the leash back in the moment the greater horror was stopped. And in the aftermath they distinguished, with the terrible precision of a people who do everything by lines, between those who had made the war an atrocity and those who had tried to prevent it. The monster went back on its leash the instant it could. That was the last proof of what they were, that even unleashed, they were governed, that the leash came out only as far as it had to and went back in the moment the horror ended, because the fear of themselves never left them, not even in the unleashing, and a people whose fear of their own monster survives even the use of the monster is a people who will never become the thing they fear, not permanently, not in their souls, however far they are forced to let the leash out. I saw Captain Okoro one more time after the war in the strange quiet of the aftermath. She was not a prisoner anymore. I was not an interrogator anymore. We were two survivors of a thing that had taught us both something terrible. And I asked her the question I had carried since the chamber, the question that was the whole of what I had learned. I asked, how do you live with it? Knowing what you are, knowing what you're capable of, knowing the monster is in you all the time, held back only by your own fear. How do you bear it? And she gave me the answer that is the end of this story, the thing I have carried ever since, the thing that finally taught me, the breaker of 300 prisoners, the difference between a creature with no fear and a creature afraid of the right thing. She said, you don't bear it by pretending it's not there. That's how you become it. The people who become monsters are almost always the ones who thought they couldn't, who never looked at the thing inside them, who were so sure of their own goodness that they never put it on a leash because they didn't believe it needed one. We're not safe because we're good. We're safe because we know we're not automatically good, because we've looked at the monster and we're afraid of it and we never, ever stop holding the leash. The fear is the safety. A people who fears their own capacity for evil is the safest people there is, because they watch themselves, because they never trust themselves, because they hold the leash even when they're sure they wouldn't need to. And a people who doesn't fear it, who's sure they're good, who never looks at the monster, that's the dangerous people, because the monster's in them too, in everyone, and they're not holding any leash at all, because they don't believe they have one. She looked at me, and there was something almost like kindness in it. You wanted to know what we fear so you could break us. But the thing we fear is the thing that makes us unbreakable, and it's also the thing that makes us safe, and those are the same thing, and that's the part your high command never understood. The fear of becoming a monster is the only thing that reliably stops you from becoming one. We're not afraid of you. We're afraid of us. And that fear is the best thing about us, and the most dangerous, and the reason you should have left us alone. I have thought about that for the rest of my life. I broke 300 prisoners by finding their fear and using it, and I came to believe that fear was a weakness, a lever, a thing that made creatures bend. And the humans taught me that I had understood fear exactly backward, that the deepest fear, the fear of one's own capacity for evil, is not a weakness but the foundation of every real strength, the only thing that reliably restrains the monster that lives in every thinking creature, the thing that makes a people both unbreakable and safe. The Dominion had no such fear. We were sure of ourselves, sure of our cause, sure of our right, and so we never looked at our own monster, never put it on a leash, and let it loose without even knowing we had loosed it, doing the horrors that finally pushed humanity to the terrible point. We were the monster that did not know it was a monster. And the humans were the monster that knew, and feared itself, and held its leash. And the difference between those two, I learned too late, is the difference between the peoples who survive and the peoples who become the horror they could not see in themselves. An alien captain demanded to know human fears, and what they said terrified her instead. The title is true, and I am that captain, and I have told you the truth of it. The humans were not afraid of anything I could do. They were afraid of themselves, of the monster every thinking creature carries, that they alone had the courage to look at and fear and leash. And that fear terrified me because I understood, sitting across from it, that I was the one who did not fear my own monster, that the Dominion was the one that thought itself too good to need a leash, and that a people who fears their own capacity for evil will always, in the end, defeat a people who is sure of their own goodness, because the fear is the leash, and the leash is the only thing that has ever stood between any of us and the worst that we could be. The humans hold their leash. We did not even know we wore one. That is the thing that terrified me, not that humanity is a monster. That they know they are, and have built, out of that terrible knowledge, the only kind of goodness that can be trusted. The goodness of a creature that fears itself and watches itself, and never, ever lets go of the chain.